Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Philosophy. This is Professor Paul Hicks. Now, today we're going to talk about a pretty famous philosopher, an important philosopher of the modern era. We often consider him to be the first major political philosopher of the modern era. Keep in mind, by modern era, we mean the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. This philosopher that we're going to talk about is by the name of Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes is going to put together an interesting way of looking at the self, about what kind of thing we are, and he's going to try to derive the type of political structures and political society that we have based upon our nature. And let's see exactly what he decides. So Thomas Hobbes, his dates are 1588 to 1679. The Leviathan, his most famous work, was published in 1651. And he starts off with a quote I'm going to give you. He says that wisdom is acquired not by reading of books, but of men. So what does this really mean? That we should read not by reading books, but by reading men? Well, one becomes wise, according to Hobbes, simply by understanding the nature of men, what it is to be a man. Now, the unwise, of course, will take a saying like this and they'll have the opportunity to say gossip about other men behind their back. That's not what Hobbes is trying to say. Well, Hobbes argues that what the saying really should mean is not to read other men, but to really read thyself. Read yourself. Understand who you are. If you want to understand what makes other people tick, get to understand what makes you tick, because you're really just like them. See, by doing this, you're going to be able to become wise about men in general. Why? Because, well, if you try and understand what you think, believe, reason, hope, fear, etc., then you're going to be able to understand what other men are actually like as well. This is because all men are similar. And by knowing what drives one, you know what drives them all. Now, this is not the same thing as saying that they all desire, fear, or hope for the same thing, because that's going to be really determined, he says, by your culture. But rather that they all have these passions of desire, fear, and hope. And that's enough to understand the nature of what it is to be a human. All right, but since, he says, we come to understand other people by first understanding ourselves, we tend to project ourselves into their actions. So we might say something along the lines of, well, why did he do that action? And we answer it by asking ourselves, well, why would I have done this action if I was in that situation? See, the problem with doing this is we start to think that everybody is just like us. And if we are evil, we then begin to see them as evil. And if we're good, we are going to begin to see them as good. So the lesson is this: do we see men as evil or good? Now, the answer, he says, will tell us how we think about ourselves. So let's go ahead and talk about what a human being actually is. Hobbes compares the human body to a machine. He says, quote, "For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body?" Man, in turn, he says, creates an artificial man. That is the state, or the commonwealth. He calls it the great Leviathan as a way of calling the state a big monster or a big behemoth. So why is this important? Well, Hobbes is challenging the very existence of a non-material soul. God, he says, created nature as the art which governs the world. He uses the word art here in the way of artificial. All right, we're not talking about paintings and that kind of thing. We're not talking about a way of doing things. We're talking about the root of artificial. So the artificial things that God creates then creates something artificial itself, and that is the state. So man is artificial and creates something artificial. So let's go ahead and try to read backwards here. We have something artificial which was created by something artificial which was created by God. So if the artificial creates the artificial, and we were created by God, then is God artificial? Read between the lines here of what Hobbes is trying to say. Right? There's good reasons to think that Hobbes is actually an atheist. I'm not going to say you have to believe that. But I think if you really read between the lines of what he's saying, it becomes rather pretty clear that he's certainly not a theist in the way that most people were. Why would he keep it between the lines? Well, try to think of yourself back in the 16th, 17th century. Being an atheist was actually a very dangerous position to take. You'll see why Hobbes actually had friends in high and powerful places. So let's go ahead and just talk about the first chapter here. So the first chapter is on sense. So he is going to be an empiricist, right? He's going to argue against a rationalist that he says everything that we know originated from some sort of sense experience. That is, we touched it, we heard it, we smelled it, we tasted it, right? Whatever, right? Our senses are what gives us information. He says, quote, "There is no conception in a man's mind which had not at first totally or by parts been begotten upon the organs of sense." What we sense is caused, he says, by an external body. That is, there's something physical outside of us. And then it somehow presses up against our sense organ. So something comes to my eye in order for me to actually see it. And it creates motion in our physical nerves. And then this motion goes to the brain and the heart. And then this gives us a sensation that there's something outside of us. Notice what he's saying here is that this is all very physical. This is, we don't have a soul, we don't have some immaterial spirit or something of that sort. We are physical beings, and our body is really just like a very complex machine. So he realizes this is, of course, in direct conflict with some of the older philosophy schools of the ancient Greeks, people like Aristotle and Plato, and Christianity. They're all teaching some sort of other doctrine. But what he says is that these organizations teach that there's something that is not physical, that is the intelligible, that the understanding is not physical, but something else, intelligible. But Hobbes doesn't, he says, I don't understand all of this talk about the non-physical, right? He calls it insignificant speech. And by this, he means it's just all meaningless. You know, what are you talking about when you say we're some sort of non-physical being and all that kind of stuff, experiencing the physical? We are physical beings. Stop talking nonsense, according to Hobbes. Okay, so what is consciousness? I mean, when you think about this, right, we're having this experience so that right now you are watching a YouTube video on a lecture of philosophy. You are aware of this lecture of philosophy. You are aware of the words that I'm actually saying. You are conscious of them. So what is consciousness? What we would call consciousness, Hobbes is going to call imagination. He describes imagination as being a decaying sense, meaning that there is a particular sense, that is, then a new particular sense, and then a new particular sense, then a new particular sense, etc., etc., etc. And so what's happening is something is, say, being impressed upon my eye or my hand to touch it or something like that, and then it happens, something else impresses upon me, then something else impresses upon me. So what consciousness really is physical stuff pressing upon our sense organs, and then the next, something else that is physical pressing upon our sense organs, and then he has what we're going to call a train of sensations. And so it's one sensation after another sensation after another sensation after another sensation, and it's just this train of sensations which is what we're going to call consciousness. So since according to Hobbes, once something is in motion, it will stay in motion, what we call thinking is just a continuing physical sensation, right? It's just one sensation coming after one sensation coming after one sensation. That's it. So as time passes, the motion, of course, is going to become less and less, and this is the process of forgetting. So what happens when I forget something? What happens when I forget what, say, something looks like? Well, say if I see a rose, and on this rose, I can see it, and it's impressing upon my eyes, and it's impressing upon my, I can smell the rose, and whatever. I'm going to forget this rose after all of the motion ceases, right? It caused motion on my nerves to send something up to my brain, and that sensation, the motion begins to go away, and that's what it means to forget something. Now, there's two types of motions, according to Hobbes, in animals. There's what he calls the vital motions. These are described as things we have no real control over. That is, things like our pulse, the blood pumping, digestion, excretion, breathing, etc. We also have what he calls voluntary motions. These are described as moving our limbs, walking, speaking, whatever we seem to will ourselves to do. Now, remember, what is sense? It's just a physical object causing motion inside our bodies. And remember, imagination is just the motion that remains after the initial sense, right? So imagination is the cause of all voluntary motions. Now, this is true even though uneducated people do not perceive their willing as an action as a motion at all. But Hobbes thinks that the imagination is just leftover motion from the senses. So this motion then moves other parts in my body, which moves my limbs, which itself just more motion. So motion can only be caused by motion, and so my limbs moving must be caused by the motion inside of me, which was caused by the original sensory motion of an external object. Okay, Hobbes is going to give a lot of different definitions, and these definitions are important because he's going to refer back to them, and these definitions are very precise. So let's go ahead and talk about the first one, to endeavor. What does it mean to endeavor? According to Hobbes, endeavor means the small beginnings of motions which initiate the more visible motion. So I endeavor to do something when the motion starts to initiate more visible motion. That is, when I start to actually do something, right? That's what it is to endeavor. Now he says we've got to talk about appetite or desire. When our endeavor is towards something, then we desire it, right? Such as hunger or thirst. When there's some particular end that we desire from our endeavor, then that's just what we call desire. Now let's think about another term, aversion. What happens when our endeavor is to get away from something? Well, then we are averse to it. And so aversion just means our endeavor is going away from something. Okay, so what is love? Well, according to Hobbes, the object of our desire is that which we love. So love and desire are almost the same thing. So when something is not present, we desire it, but when something is present, we love it. But what about hate? We're averse to that as well. The object of our aversion. I hate something when I am averse to it, right? All right, the next one, contempt. That which we neither desire nor hate. How about good? What is the definition of good? Whatever we have an appetite for. If we like something, we call it good. If we don't, bad. So whatever we have an aversion to or hate is not good, but that's what we call evil. So evil is something that we call bad or evil. It's just something that we hate. It's something that we're averse to. It's not evil in itself. It has a lot to do with us and our reaction to it, right? Now this next term, felicity, this is going to be really important for Thomas Hobbes because felicity, let us talk about what felicity is. So felicity, according to Hobbes, is simply obtaining those things which we desire, right? It is the continual success in obtaining those things which man desires. Aristotle used the term eudaimonia, but Hobbes is going to use the term felicity. Okay, and then of course we have the passions. And the passions are going to be a general umbrella for what all the above fall under. So Hobbes actually, keep in mind, has many, many definitions, but I'm not going to go through all of them, just the ones that we need to go through. Okay, let's look at the definition for power. What is power? A power is simply a man's ability to obtain some good. I have the power to obtain, let's say, gold, right? My ability to obtain gold is my power to obtain gold. Now, there's two different kinds of power, according to Hobbes. There's what he calls natural power and what he calls instrumental power. Natural power are things which are just natural to us, something along the lines of our mind, our strength, our wit. Then there's what's called instrumental power. Now, these are going to be things which we use to get something that we want. It's not what we want in and of itself, but it gets us what we want in the end. So something like money, reputation, friends. Money is not all that important for what it is. I only want a bunch of money because it gets me things that I think are important to me. Okay, what is worth? How do I know that somebody has worth? Worth simply means the measure of somebody's power. If somebody has a lot of power, then by definition, they have greater worth. To honor. Now, this is just simply, when somebody says, that person has honor, what are we saying about them? It just means we say they have high worth. And what is worth? The measure of somebody's power. So notice that this isn't relative to us, this is relative to other people, right? So dishonor is to just say this person has low worth, right? They have low power. Now, worthiness. Worthiness is a man's ability to perform a particular function, right? Our ability to perform a particular function. That means that we are worthy. All right, and dignity. Let's talk about dignity. Dignity is the publicly recognized worth of a man. So once again, dignity is not something that is internal to you, but it is external of the rest of society and how they actually view you. These are all of the qualities which affect our social relations. So a little note on worth, Hobbes states that a man's worth is set by other men and not man himself. Right? You want to say, well, I'm worthy, I have some sort of intrinsic value to myself. No, not according to Hobbes. Your worth is really what other people set it to be. So for Hobbes, he says, for let a man, as most men do, rate themselves at the highest value they can, yet their true value is no more than is esteemed by others. Okay, what is this a direct stab at? This is a direct dig at Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher who thought a man's virtue is created from the deeds and is not dependent upon what other people think of him, right? That happiness comes from his actions and they're not dependent on others. Hobbes is going the opposite way. Your worth is really dependent upon others, and it has nothing really to do with you. Just because you consider yourself worthy doesn't mean other people do, and you're not worthy unless other people think so. Right? I know that this is probably, goes against the value system you might have, but let's try to stick within the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes if we can. Okay, so we are always trying to satisfy our desires. And so what our felicity is a continual progress of desire for one object to another, to another, to another. And notice here, we're never actually satisfied. We're always going from one object to another. We always want more, right? Think of like billionaires, somebody like Elon Musk or Zuckerberg or, whoever. Why don't they just, quit? Because they want more, right? They want more and more and more and more and more and more and more. So according to Hobbes, he says, there is no utmost aim. There is no greatest good, as is spoken about by the old moral philosophers. He's going against people like Aristotle and Plato here, right? He says, nor can a man any more live whose desires are at an end than he whose senses and imaginations are at a stand. The very fact that you're living means that you have desires. This is just a brute fact, according to Thomas Hobbes. He says if we do not sense and we do not have imagination, then that's just what it means to be dead. You're not alive, right? If you're not sensing, you don't have anything going on in your head, that means you're dead, okay? So we're always trying to obtain that which we desire, not just to enjoy it once, but we want to have it over and over and over again. Why? Our felicity depends upon it. Our felicity, our happiness is derived by us getting what we want over and over and over again. Notice here we're very self-centered. Right? This is going to be important for Thomas Hobbes' philosophy. He says, quote, I put a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. And the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he has present, without the acquisition of more. So in order to have power, in order to have worth, you're always going to have to get more and more stuff. And in order to be happy, your felicity depends upon you getting whatever it is that you want over and over and over again. So think about this. What is he saying about the nature of what it means to be a human? What is he saying about the nature of personhood here? We're really greedy, aren't we? I mean, are we just greedy pigs? See, it seems to be that that's what Hobbes has an understanding of. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into Hobbes' understanding of religion, because religion is going to play an important role in all societies. And what is it that Hobbes thinks of religion? Well, let's start out with this quote. He says, "Seeing there are no signs nor fruit of religion but in man only, there is no cause to doubt but that the seed of religion is also only in man and consists in some peculiar quality, or at least in some eminent degree thereof, not to be found in other living creatures." So, for example, my dog probably doesn't have any sort of religion. My cat probably doesn't have any sort of religion. My bunnies probably don't have any sort of religion. Who has religion? Human beings have religion. Who creates religion? Human beings create religion. Where does it come from? It comes from their own mind. It's not coming from outside of them. It's coming from inside of them, right? So Hobbes thinks that there are three qualities of why humans create and produce religion. One, he says, men want to know about the causes of the events that they see. We want to know what caused whatever events. We want to know, we notice that, hey, this event is happening and it must have been caused by something. What was that cause? Right? And our belief in cause and effect causes us to create religion. He says, seeing anything that has a beginning, a man's going to think that it had a cause that made it begin at that time rather sooner than later. Right? So what was that cause? What's created everything? Well, the other thing that man observes is that one event comes from another and remembers the order in which they occurred. And when he can't be sure of the true causes of things, he either supposes causes for them or forms beliefs about their causes by trusting the authority of other men who he thinks are wiser than he is. So what's happening here is men are constantly looking for a cause to things, including things like their good luck and their bad luck. And these qualities, are going to cause some sort of uncertainty and anxiety in men. Why? Well, because since he thinks that there are causes for everything, it's going to be impossible for a man who continually tries to make himself safe against the evil he fears and to procure the good he desires, not to be in a perpetual state of anxiety about the future. Since he's actually ignorant of the causes of all things, he carries within him a perpetual fear. So we don't understand the causes of all things, and this actually makes us afraid. But this fear, he says, needs to be a fear of something. We can't just walk around being afraid. We have to be afraid of something. And that is man just have an object for what they're afraid of. So when man does not see the object that he should be afraid of or why he's either having good luck or bad luck, what he does is then he attributes this type of luck or these types of causes to what Hobbes calls an invisible power or agent. This is going to be what? Invisible power or agent. This is going to be things like ghosts or spirits or gods or something like that. But here's the thing. How can a power or agent be invisible? Because isn't everything just physical matter? Doesn't Hobbes talk about that? Well, according to Hobbes, since man finds himself in a situation where he must attribute a cause of his luck to an invisible agent, he comes to believe in things like ghosts or spirits and the like. Man invents these things and then attributes the same spirit or soul to himself, and then they attribute their luck to the invisible spirit. So human beings then come to believe that they are themselves some sort of soul or some sort of spirit here. But notice, we come to believe that. That doesn't make it true. We're not a soul. We're not a spirit. Right? But this is what we come to believe anyways. He says, since they are always trying to attain what they desire, and the objects of their desires are sometimes caused not by themselves, but say an unknown secondary cause, that is, the great invisible spirit, they create a worship towards this spirit. Ceremonies, reverence, right? People bow down, kneeling, careful address. Their offers of thanks and gifts are created for this invisible agent. So just think about, say, maybe what a Catholic does when they go into a church, right? They do the cross on their across their chest, right? Or what some people do, say they bow, or they kneel in church for praying. Why do you do this? Well, it's because you're worshiping whatever that great spirit happens to be. All right? And you create offerings for this great spirit, and you create sacrifices for this great spirit because you see them as the one which are providing you good luck or bad luck. So lastly, eventually, one of the ceremonies that will be performed and a stroke of good luck are going to occur. So you perform one of these ceremonies, something good just happens to occur, and what are you going to think? Oh, it was my performing this ceremony which caused this good luck to actually occur. But is that actually the case? Right? He says man's going to find this event as a cause for the luck, and they're going to see future events or ceremonies as omens. Okay, so why is it that human beings believe in religion? What is the cause of this belief in religion? Well, we could sum it up as, one, humans have this ignorance of causes. Two, we come to believe in ghosts, that is, some sort of spirits out there that are creating these causes. And then three, we devote that which towards what men fear. And then four, we take causal episodes to actually be omens. So these are the four seeds of religion which are found inside man, not from an outside influence like an actual real God. So since men differ in their imaginations and passions, we would expect to find rituals and ceremonies to differ greatly as well. And in fact, we do. If you look around the world, people have different ceremonies and ways of practicing religion. This confirms to Hobbes that religion is simply invented by man. It's not coming from without, we create it within ourselves. Now, why do other animals not have religion? He says the reason other animals do not have religion is because they take happiness in the immediate enjoyment of, say, their food, lazing around, or their lust. Other animals are unable to remember, say, the order, consequence, and dependence of causes, so they don't have to look for a cause of these things. They don't have a need or a reason to invent God. Okay, so let's think about what the natural condition of mankind is. Hobbes here proposes a thought experiment of what would happen if there was no civilization, there was no government around. This is what we call a natural condition, or what we're going to call the state of nature. Now, there was never a time where we were in this state of nature. He's not saying that, but it's a thought experiment. What would human beings be like if, in fact, there was no government, there was no state? All right, and society hasn't been structured in any sort of way. We're just living out in nature. Well, according to Hobbes, there is this quote. He says, nature had made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker in mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable, as that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit, to which another may not pretend as well as he. For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by the confederacy of others that are in the same danger as himself. So what is he actually saying here? Right? You might be physically stronger than me, and I might be weaker than you, but guess what? I can get a gun, and I can shoot you. Or I can get a bunch of other small people together, or weaker people, and we can overpower you, right? So this, he says, is what the nature of human beings really are. Now, as to the faculties of mind, what does he mean by this? He says, look, I find a greater equality amongst men than that of strength, right? We like to think of ourselves as smarter or more wise than other people, and other people as less wise than us. But really, we're all pretty much the same, right? We talk about education of the sciences and the arts of our words. These people, people that go off and get college degrees and people that go off and become educated, they're actually really the few people. Most people won't actually go on and become educated, become really critical thinkers. It's not a native faculty to be like this, right? We're not born critical thinkers or born wise or something like that. And very few people will ever attempt or try to attain that. He says, it seems to me that some men have greater wisdom than others, and it's an incredible claim to say that men are generally equal in their mental faculties. Hobbes answers that by saying, that which may perhaps make such equality incredible is but a vain conceit of one's own wisdom, which among almost all men think they have, in a greater degree than the vulgar. That is, than all men but themselves and a few others, whom by fame or for concurring with themselves they approve. For such is the nature of men, that howsoever they may acknowledge many others to be more witty or more eloquent or more learned, yet they will hardly believe that there be many so wise as themselves. So we pretty much love ourselves, right? When you think of somebody and say, hey, they're very wise, what is happening here? You're comparing them to you, right? And because of your own love for your own self, you're saying, well, if they're like me, then they must be really wise. They must be really smart. So Hobbes thinks that the fact that people all see themselves as the really wise ones, it really only shows how equal people really are, right? We're not all that different. So since people are really more or less equal, then what happens, say, when two people who are equal, they want something? And if they want the same thing, but they say they cannot both have it, what's going to happen, say, if we're out in the savannah or out in the jungle, right? We're in this state of nature, and there's, say, an antelope that I just killed. What is it? And there's only one. Either I can have it or somebody else can have it. What's going to happen? We're both going to want it, and what's going to happen? Hobbes argues they become enemies, and they then endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So, hence, what we come to fear is somebody trying to take what we have. We will try to take what others have, and they will try to take what we have. But if a man puts himself in a position that makes him strong so another can't take his stuff, then what Hobbes argues is, quote, they will come with united forces to dispossess and deprive him not only of the fruit of his labor, but also of life or liberty. And the invader again is in the like danger from another. So, in the state of nature, man finds himself in a state of war where every man is out for himself. There's no way any man can secure himself so that he can master all possible invaders, because they can always increase their power enough to endanger him. So what's going to happen in this state of nature is man will attempt to secure himself by taking all that he can and preserving it, but others are going to attempt to take it from him, so he's constantly looking over his shoulder. This, he says, is a state of war. And in the state of war, there are going to be three principal causes of quarrel. All right? What's going to cause quarreling? One, it's going to be competition, right? We have to compete to get whatever it is that we actually want, and this is going to cause us to fight. We can't all have the same things. There's going to be limited supply of something. The other thing is our safety. In order to protect myself, I'm going to strike first. I'm going to attack you so that you don't attack me. The other reason that we might quarrel is because of reputation or glory. We talk about, say, soldiers of being honorable or being glorious or having good reputation, right? This increases my well-being by making you afraid of me, but also some men are going to start to take delight in conquest. So what Hobbes thinks is that during the time that men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they're in a condition that he calls war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. So what is war? Right? War, he says, consists not only in the battles, but in the time between the battles, where battle is known to be imminent or the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. It's not necessary to actually be fighting all the time to be in a state of war. Because what's happening in between the battles? You're preparing for war, you're thinking about war, you're constantly actually at war. Okay, so what's going to happen as a consequence of this state of war? Well, this is one of the more famous quotes of Thomas Hobbes Leviathan. He says, in this state of war, in such a condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving, and removing such things as require much force. There's no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, there's continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So let's think about that for just a bit. How optimistic is Hobbes here, right? The natural condition of man is to be at war with everybody else. We are self-centered beings. We are seeking our own felicity. That is, we are seeking that which is good to us, that which we actually want over and over and over. We're constantly trying to get something, and I have to either get it myself, take it from you, or whatever. And this is going to put us at war with each other. So humans are, in some sense, what we would say are naturally bad or naturally evil. Okay, so some of you might be thinking, hey, I'm not like that, right? I'm not a horrible person. I trust my family. I trust the people of society not to, go into some sort of state of nature. Well, let's think this way then, he says. He says, to prove that man actually doesn't trust other men, he says, just look at ourselves and our actions. He says, quote, let him therefore consider with himself when taking a journey. He arms himself and seeks to go well accompanied. When going to sleep, he locks his doors. When even in his house, he locks his chest. And this when he knows there are laws and public officers armed to revenge all injuries that shall be done to him. What opinion does he have of his fellow subjects when he rides armed, of his fellow citizens when he locks his doors, and of his children and servants when he locks his chest? Does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my words? So think about this. When you go, say, to the shopping mall, do you lock your car in the parking lot? Why? Why? Do you lock your door of your house when you go out? Why? Because you're afraid somebody's going to get in and take stuff. In other words, you know that humans are actually evil and that are self-obsessed and are always trying to get what they want, even if it goes against you. And in order to protect yourself and to protect your property, you lock doors. Aren't you really saying the same thing as Hobbes? Aren't you really saying that human beings are evil and they're going to do evil, so I have to protect myself against them? Now look, Hobbes admits that there was never a time nor a condition of war as this, but he says, and here comes the racist part, he says, just look at the savage people of many places in the America. Told you, the racist part. He says many of them actually live like this or live very close to this. He says also, if we look at countries who are under no international authority or law, aren't they not in fact in a state of war? Because they uphold thereby the industry of their subjects, there does not follow from it that the misery which accompanies the liberty of particular men? Where there were no common power to fear by the manner of life which men that have formerly lived under a peaceful government used to denigrate into a civil war, right? All right, so to understand Hobbes is to understand that he believes that we live in a state of war unless we have some sort of great state or somebody to actually control us and keep us in line. So in this state of war, in this state of nature, do we have any sort of rights or anything of that sort? Hobbes thinks that we do. And he's going to say what a right of nature is. He says, the right of nature is a liberty that each man has to make his own decisions about how to use his own power for the preservation of his own life. Right? Hobbes seems to think that we have a right from our very nature to do whatever it is we think best to preserve our own life. We have the liberty to do whatever it is we think will preserve our own life. Notice there's no actual objective right or wrong here. It's my own judgment about how to preserve my own life. So if killing you, in my judgment, might help me achieve my own preservation, I have a right of nature to do it. All right? So what is this right of nature? The liberty that each man has to make his own decisions about how to use his own power for the preservation of his own life. All right, so let's talk about liberty. What does it mean to say that a man has liberty? Liberty simply is the absence of obstacles which would take away a man's power to do what he wants. Okay, well, if there are rights of nature, are there also laws of nature? Hobbes thinks that there is. He says, he defines a law of nature as a command or general rule discovered by reason which forbids a man to do anything that is destructive of his life or takes away his means for preserving his life. So what's the difference here between a right and a law? According to Hobbes, a right consists in the liberty to do as one chooses, where a law picks out what a man should do and obligates him to do it. So a right differs from a law like obligation differs from liberty. They're inconsistent with each other. That is, they are in fact opposites. So remember, in the natural condition of mankind, that is in this state of war, every man can do whatever he likes that might help him to preserve his life against his enemies. And as a result, man is governed by his own reason. And it follows that if man is to stay in his natural state, he can be sure of dying early. So, there is what he's going to call the first law of nature. Hobbes derives from the understanding the state of war that everybody will find themselves in and how life is nasty, brutish, and short. We could derive the first law of nature, that is, to seek peace and follow it. So the first law of nature is to seek peace and follow it. Now the flip side to the law is what we're going to call the right of nature, and that's the right to defend ourselves by any means that we can. Okay, well, let's go back to the first law of nature, seek peace and follow it. He says, from this first law, we can actually derive a second law. And that is, when a man thinks that peace and self-defense require it, he should be willing, when others are too, to lay down his right to everything and should be contented with as much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So as long as every man can do what he wants, we are going to remain into a state of war. We're never going to get out of it. And life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short. But if you refuse to lay down your rights, then I have no reason to lay down my rights. But if I lay down my rights and you did not, then I'm going to open myself up as prey and you're going to be the predator. So what we need to do is what Hobbes calls the law of the gospel. That is, whatsoever you requires that others should do for you, you should do for them. So this in turn derives what he calls the law of man. Do not unto others what you would not have done unto you. Right? I'm sure you've heard that before. Okay, so as long as everybody's able to do what they want, then we're going to remain in a state of war. And we want to try to get out of the state of war. Remember, we want to seek peace and follow it. Okay? So let's talk about what it means to lay down a man's right to anything. So for example, he says, when I lay down my right to something, I deprive myself the liberty of blocking you from getting the benefit of your right to the same thing. By my giving up my right, I do not give a right to any other man, since all men have a right by nature to everything. All I do is to commit to not interfering in your business. Hobbes says I can both renounce my right, or he says I can transfer my right. So what's the difference? Renouncing is just to say, I renounce my right. I don't care who gets the benefit of it. I am just renouncing it. I'm getting rid of it. Transferring a right, that is where I intend for a certain person that right to go to a very particular person or persons. I'm transferring these rights to somebody else. So when a man transfers or renounces a right, he is said to be bounded not to hinder those to whom such right is now given. If they do, to hinder the transfer or renouncing of rights is called an injustice, and an injury has been done. So what is injustice? Is the not performance of your covenant. So when a man transfers or renounces a right, he does so because he's going to get something in return, right? I'm not just going to transfer my rights to you unless you give me something back. So either I get a right transferred to him, or he's going to get some sort of good. So this is because the transfer or renounce a right is voluntary, and the goal of all of our voluntary actions is for some good. Remember, felicity. So from this, there's going to be some rights that no man can be taken to abandon or transfer, no matter what words or other signs he uses. So for example, a man cannot lay down the right of resisting those who bring force against him to take away his life, because there would be no good for him in doing so. All right? Another thing is, no man can be said to consent to wounds, chains, and imprisonment. Why would he? And in violation of the point of the entire procedure of renouncing and transferring rights, the purpose of giving up my rights is for some good in preserving my security, life, and means for preservation of my security and life. So if a man by words or other signs seems to deprive himself of the very thing for which those signs were intended, he should not be understood to have meant it. All right? So if it is if trying to transfer or renouncing my rights is a violation of what is I cannot do, then it should be interpreted that I never actually did it. Okay, so what we have here now is a contract. That is, we are going to have a mutual transferring of rights. Now, how do we void this contract? So if two men make a covenant, in which the performance of the promise is not done now but sometime in the future, then if one party has reasonable suspicion that the other will not perform their part, then the contract is void. So, for example, think of, say, maybe you're going to have a plumber come by and do some work at your house, right? Would you pay the plumber before they do the work? Well, not if you think that you have some sort of reasonable suspicion to think that they're not going to do the work, right? Then the contract's going to become void. And they're not going to do the work unless they have reasonable suspicion that you're going to pay them, right? So Hobbes argues that the fear of suspicion must come after the contract was made, because for that which cannot hinder a man from promising ought not to be admitted as a hindrance of performing. So, for example, we make a contract that if you do A quality work, you'll get an A in the class. But if you reasonably suspect that I will give you less than an A, even if you do A quality work, are you obligated to do it? Are you going to do A quality work if you believe that I'm just going to fail you no matter what? Right? That's not, you're not going to do it. So he says, for one who performs first has no assurance that the other will perform later, because the bonds of words are too weak to rein in men's ambitions, greed, anger, and other passions, unless there is something to be feared from some coercive power. So contracts are only going to work if there's some sort of force that forces you to fulfill the contract. All right? These are going to be, say, society creates laws to do this type of stuff. So what do we need? We need to have some sort of common power that's above both parties of the contract, which right and force are sufficient to compel performance. The contract isn't made void simply by the suspicions of either party to it. And so what Hobbes is doing here is he's setting up this need for some sort of common coercive power. In the state of nature, if I enter into a covenant by fear, I'm bound to fulfill it. Having been coerced or exploited into making a contract is no reason for not holding up my fulfillment of it. If I was kidnapped and agreed to pay ransom for my life, then I have to pay it even after I'm released. If a weaker country promises something for the sake of peace, they're bound to fulfill their end of the contract. There is no right to nullify a contract just because it's no longer advantageous to me now. You have to fulfill your contracts even if it doesn't benefit you anymore. That's what a contract is, and that's what justice is going to be. So an earlier covenant can make void a later one. That is, if I have a contract with you to do something, I can't release myself from that contract and give it to somebody else. The contract is already with you. He says, I cannot contract with somebody else to do something I'm already obligated to do with another man. Why? Well, because for a man who gave his right to one man yesterday, he doesn't have it to give to somebody else today. So the later promise doesn't transfer any right and is null. I gave my right away yesterday, right? So I can't give it away today because I don't have it anymore. So how are we freed from covenants? Well, there's two ways to be freed from a covenant. One, you can perform it. That is, a performance naturally just brings obligation to an end, and you can fulfill the contract. The other is to be forgiven from it. Now, in a civil society, civil law can do this. So, for example, as in being forgiven of a debt. What happens? Forgiveness then restores liberty because it hands back the right in which the obligation consisted. All right, so when should covenants always be considered null and void? Well, according to Hobbes, a covenant not to defend myself from force is null and void. Why? Because I cannot transfer my right to save myself from death, wounds, and imprisonment, and so a promise not to resist force doesn't transfer any right and isn't binding. So compare the following two covenants. Unless I do such and such, kill me. And compare it to, unless I do such and such, I won't resist you when you come to kill me. Now, the first one I can make, but the second one I cannot. For man, why? Because man by nature chooses the lesser evil, which is the danger of death from resisting, rather than the greater, which is certain and present death from not resisting. What Hobbes argues is that everyone accepts this, and proof of this is the fact that criminals lead to execution in prison are done so with armed men, even though they have consented to the law by which they've been condemned. Why? Why is it when somebody is led off to be put to death, are they hauled in by other people who are armed? Well, because we expect they're going to try to escape, right? They're going to try to save their life. It would only be in their nature to actually do so. Okay, so a covenant to accuse oneself without assurance of a pardon, those are going to be considered null and void. Because in the state of nature, there's no place for accusations. In the civil state, the accusation without pardon is followed by punishment, which is a force that man is not obliged to give into. Okay, let's think about torture for just a bit. Would I ever consent to being tortured? Hobbes argues that accusations made under torture are to be considered corrupted by nature, therefore they shouldn't be believed. Torture should be used as a way of getting ideas and leads for the further search for truth. Any testimony that a person gives under torture is not necessarily truthful, because what is said under torture is not said to be the truth, but it's said to relieve the pain of the torture itself. So we cannot know if accusations brought against are true or false, for they are given when the tortured are exercising his right to preserve his own life. All right? So, since the force of words being too weak to hold men to the performance of their covenants, there are in man's nature but two imaginable helps to strengthen it. And those are either a fear of the consequences of breaking their word, or a glory or pride in appearing not to need to break it. This latter is a generosity too rarely found to be presumed on, especially in the pursuers of wealth, command, or sensual pleasure, which are the greatest part of mankind. The passion to be reckoned upon is fear, whereof there be two very general objects. One, the power of spirits invisible, the other, the power of those men they shall therein offend. Of these two, though the former be the greater power, yet the fear of the latter is commonly the greater fear. So what are we saying here? There is a fear of invisible spirits. Remember what Hobbes calls this as man's religion. This fear of invisible spirits exists in the state of nature, but the fear of a human power does not, or at least not enough to make men keep their promises. Because in the raw condition of nature, the inequality of power is only evident with the outcome of battle. Okay, so the second law of nature. Well, the second law of nature obliges us to transfer to someone else any rights of ours, that retention of which would hinder the peace of mankind. Because remember in the first law, we're supposed to seek peace and follow it. So Hobbes thinks that we can derive a third law here, and that's going to be that men should perform the covenants they make. If you make a promise to do something, do it. That's going to be the third law of nature, which is derived from 1 and 2. Why? Well, because without it, covenants are useless. They're just empty words. And all men would retain the right to do all things that we are still in the condition of war. So we don't get out of the condition of war unless we actually perform the covenants we make, unless we fulfill the promises that we make. So the third law is going to be the source of justice here. So as stated earlier, when no covenant has been made, no right has been transferred, so every man has a right to everything, no action is considered to be just or unjust. But when a covenant is made, to break it is injustice. That's what it means to be unjust, is to break your covenant. Whatever isn't unjust is therefore just. So some covenants cannot be made, say when one party fears that the other party won't perform. The labels just and unjust can only have application when the fear is actually taken away. So the fear can only be taken away, he says, when, quote, there is some coercive power to compel all men equally to perform their covenants through the terror of some punishment, greater than the benefit they expect from breaking their covenant, and thereby to ensure that men get the benefits they contract for, this being compensation for giving up some of their rights. So what is this actually saying? We're going to need to have some sort of power that is going to force people to fulfill their covenants, to fulfill their actual promises. And we need to be able to punish to such a degree to make people actually do it, and to make it the fulfilling the covenant to be the better option. So the ordinary understanding of justice, he says, is the steady willingness to give every man his own. But there is no own that is property. There's just injustice. Where there is no coercive power, there's no actual property, because every man has a right to all things. Therefore, where there's no commonwealth, there's no injustice, because the validity of covenants begins only with the setting up of a civil power sufficient to compel men to keep them. There is no such thing as justice or injustice. Society dictates what is just and what is unjust. And that's formed by the fulfilling the covenants which are only made within the commonwealth and not in the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, everybody has a right to do whatever they want, and if there's no coercive power to force me to perform my covenant, I might not do it. All right. So if you go think about Plato, for example, Plato thinks that justice exists independent of man in the material world. Right. To be reasonable is to be just for Plato. But not according to Hobbes. It is society which creates the concepts of justice and injustice. All right. Hobbes says, he therefore that breaks his covenant and consequently declares that he thinks he may with reason do so, cannot be received into any society that unite themselves for peace and defense, but by the error of them that receive him, nor when he is received be retained in it, without seeing the danger of their error, which errors a man cannot reasonably reckon upon as the means of his security, and therefore if he be left or cast out of society, he perishes. So somebody might argue that they should deny the rules of an earthly kingdom and follow the laws of a higher law. You might say, I am following God's law. Okay, well, following the higher laws allows one to attain eternal happiness after death. They think that any breach of a covenant may conduce to that end and consequently be just and reasonable. For example, those who think it a work of piety to pursue, depose, and kill their kings under a pretext of a war of religion. Well, what's the problem with this? Well, the problem with this, according to Thomas Hobbes, is, quote, there's no knowledge of what man's situation will be after death, much less of what reward will then be given for breach of faith, but only a belief based upon other men saying that they know this supernaturally, or that they know people who knew others who knew it supernaturally. So breach of faith can't be called a precept of reason or nature. Okay, so what does it mean then to be a just man? Well, a just man is one who attempts to make his actions just, and a non-just man is one who neglects caring that his actions be just. So it's possible that a just man do an unjust act. This does not make him unjust, but guilty in the instance of just this act. Hobbes goes on to give several other laws of nature. There's 19 in total. I'm not going to go through all of them. They deal with things like forgiveness, compliance, equality, mediation, that type of thing. But I want to give you some of them, right? So the next one I'm going to talk about is what he calls his fifth law of nature. And that is every man should strive to accommodate himself to the rest. You should try, according to this fifth law of nature, you should try to get along with other people in society. By not doing so, people are going to come to see you and dislike you. They're going to see you as being difficult. They're not going to promote peace, and therefore they will violate the first law of nature. So you need to try to assimilate yourself into society and not be so difficult and not be so disagreeable. He says the laws of nature are immutable and eternal, for injustice, ingratitude, arrogance, pride, inequity, exception of persons, and the rest can never be made lawful, for it can never be that war shall preserve life and peace destroy it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the causes, creation, and the definition of a commonwealth itself. He says, let's ask this question. Since men naturally love liberty and dominion over men, why would they allow any restraint upon themselves? Right? If men naturally love liberty and their dominion over other people, why would we allow restraint? Well, the answer, according to Hobbes, it is the prospect of our own preservation, right? Of a more contented life. It's getting ourselves out of this miserable condition of war. That's why we do it. We need a government which will force us to act according to the laws of nature rather than our natural passions. Because without such a power, our natural passions are going to take over. Covenants, he says, quote, covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure man at all. All right, another question. Can't we just pull together a small group of men to give us some security? Hobbes' answer is no. If we only have a small group of men, then it would only take a small group of men to invade. So however large a society we have, the actions must be directed not to individual wants and beliefs, but toward the larger interest. If we have a society where everybody is individualistic, then what you're going to find is infighting amongst ourselves. You're going to be easily targeted by enemies because infighting helps them, right? If our society is broken apart, there's this divide and conquer kind of mentality, then another society can come in and take over, all right? So, according to Hobbes, he says we need to erect some sort of common power to defend us against the invasion of foreigners. And we need to erect a common power to defend us against the injuries of one another and to secure them in such a sort as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth, they may nourish themselves and live contently. So we need to confer all the power and strength to one man or upon one assembly of men that may reduce all of our wills into one will. We need to acknowledge that this leader will as our own will, because doing so will secure the common peace and safety of us all. We will all submit our wills and our judgment to the will and judgment of the man or assembly of men to lead us. This, he says, creates unity. So it is as if every man should say to every other man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. This is the creation of the commonwealth. This is the great Leviathan that we're talking about in this book. Right? I will give up my rights on the condition that other people give up their rights to. All right. So since all men give their power and will to this man or assembly of men, there's going to be a lot of power and strength is bestowed upon this new authority. That by so much power, they'll be able to harmonize the wills of all of them for the preservation of peace at home and aid against enemies abroad. So it is in this new authority, though, that consists the essence of what the commonwealth, which is defined. What is the commonwealth? It's one person of whose acts a great multitude, by mutual covenants, one with another, have made themselves every one the author, to the end he may use the strength and means of them all, as he shall think expedient for their peace and common defense. The person who has this power is going to be called the sovereign. So whoever has the power, say in a democracy, the people are the sovereign. In a monarchy, the monarch is the sovereign. Right? In an aristocracy, the aristocrats are the sovereign. Right? Whoever has the power is the sovereign, and whoever does not are the subjects. Now, there's two ways that we can obtain this power, that one can obtain. They can obtain it by force, that is being able to destroy those who do not submit. This is what Hobbes calls a commonwealth by acquisition. Or we can have it through agreement. This is when men agree amongst themselves to submit to one man or assembly of men voluntarily, or confidence to be protected by him against all other. This Hobbes calls a commonwealth by institution. So, what is the rights of sovereigns by this institution? From the institution are derived all the power and all the rights of the one, the supreme power, as well as the duties of all the citizens. Hobbes lists out 12 points where he's discussing the rights, powers, and duties. And they are as follows. He says, 1, because people make a covenant, it is to be understood they aren't obliged by any previous covenant which conflicts with this new one. Those bound by a previous covenant are obedient to their first sovereign and must have his permission to break it. Next, the subjects are bound to each other to be the proclaimed author of everything that their existing sovereign does and judges fit to be done. If any one man dissents, then the other should break their covenant with him who is unjust. If any subject tries to depose the sovereign, they're trying to talk something which does not belong to them. That is injustice. If anyone who tried to depose the sovereign is killed or punished by the sovereign, then they are the author of their own punishment. This is because the covenant makes them an author of everything the sovereign does. And since it is injustice for a man to do anything which he may be punished by his own authority, his attempt to depose the sovereign is unjust. So if you think about, say, like earlier American philosophy, that we can overthrow a tyrant or something like that, that would be completely wrong according to Hobbes. You can't do that because the sovereign is the one that has power, and you've already transferred your rights over to the sovereign. So for those men who claim to base their disobedience on a covenant with God, he goes, this is unjust. There is no covenant with God, except through the mediation of somebody who represents God. But whoever is God's lieutenant has sovereignty under God, so it is not a covenant with God himself. The claim of a covenant with God is so obviously a lie, even to claim its own consciousness, that it is the act of a disposition that is not only unjust, but also vile and unmanly. Ooh, think about that for a bit. A covenant with God is so obviously a lie, the act of a disposition that is not only unjust, but is vile and unmanly. All right. The other point he wants to make is that the covenant is made between all of the subjects, and it's not with the sovereign and the subjects. So the subjects are going to create a covenant amongst themselves, which creates the actual sovereign. So the sovereign is created out of the actual covenant. So subjects are not making a covenant with the sovereign. Subjects are making covenant with each other, which then creates the sovereign. So why is this important? Well, there cannot be a breach of the covenant on the part of the sovereign because it wasn't made with the sovereign. The sovereign didn't make a covenant with you. None of the subjects can be freed from the subjection by claiming that the sovereign broke the covenant because, once again, the sovereign didn't make the covenant. So why is the covenant not made with the sovereign and his people? Well, if it was, it must be done as a covenant with the sovereign and the whole multitude, or a separate covenant with each man. It can't be the whole multitude, because at the point of creating a commonwealth, they are not one person. But if they are separate covenants, then they all become void once the sovereign becomes sovereign. Why? Because any breach would be a breach on the part of the subject. They are the ones who handed over their power and will to whatever his power and will is. Therefore, they are breaking their covenant by not following their earlier covenant. And if the covenant was made with the sovereign, then who would judge any disputes? The covenant says the sovereign was. Right? So the sovereign judges any disputes, would judge any disputes between you and the sovereign on the covenant, and so the sovereign's always going to win. So remember, covenants only make sense when there is a coercive power to enforce them, and this coercive power is the sovereign. All right, so 3, since the majority have by consenting voices declared as sovereign, someone who dissents can be destroyed by the others. Either he consented to the covenant and is being unjust by breaking it, or he did not consent to the covenant and is in the state of war. Man is in before the covenant and can therefore be destroyed for any reason at all without it being unjust. Remember, where does justice come from? From the society itself. So every subject is, by this institution, the author of all the actions and judgments of the sovereign. It follows that nothing that the sovereign does can be wrong of any of his subjects. Since he is the author of what the sovereign does, it follows that to say the sovereign was wrong is to say that complaining subject was wrong against himself. While the sovereign may commit inequities, that is, that he might do wicked things, he's not strictly speaking being unjust or causing an injury. Remember, as we defined this earlier, justice is to fulfill your covenant, and injustice is to break it. Right? So there's no outside justice or concept of injustice. It's all within the society and of the sovereign itself. So no sovereign, he says, can justly be put to death or punished by his subjects. Since the subject is the author of the actions of the sovereign, he would be punishing the sovereign for something they themselves authorize, and that wouldn't be right. They are punishing him for acts committed by themselves. All right, the 6th point that he wants to make is that the sovereign is the judge of what opinions and doctrines are threats to peace, which ones support it, which men are to be trusted to speak to the many, on what occasions and far they should be allowed to go, who shall examine the doctrines of all books before they are published. So there's not necessarily a freedom of the press. He says, since the actions of men come from their opinions, it is in the interest of peace and harmony for the sovereign to govern their opinions. Think about that. The government should be controlling the opinions. The sovereign should be controlling the opinions, not you. So no freedom of thought. Why? Because this is how your actions, if the sovereign is supposed to control your actions, they have to control your opinions because your opinions cause your actions. All right. The seventh point that Hobbes wants to make is that the sovereign has the whole power of prescribing rules that let every man know what goods he may enjoy and what men can call property. Since prior to the covenant all men have the right to all things, we give up this right to the sovereign in the covenant in the interest of peace. Remember our first law, seek peace and follow it? To decide who gets what and why is the role of the sovereign and is why we instituted the covenant in the first place. The eighth point is that the sovereign alone has the right of judging between disputes. So if controversies were not decided, then one subject has no protection against being wronged by another, and every man retains the conditions of war, which, remember, is contrary to the purpose for which the Commonwealth is instituted. The sovereign, number 9, the sovereign alone has the right to make war and peace with other nations. This requires that he has a right to, right? 1, judge when war is good. Next, what size military forces are to be assembled, and to tax subjects to pay for the forces. The sovereign gets to make those decisions. Another thing the sovereign can do is point 10, that is, the sovereign chooses all counselors, ministers, magistrates, and offices in both peace and war. The sovereign gets to decide who is in what position. Why? Because the sovereign is the one in control. The sovereign, in point 11, the sovereign has the power of rewarding with riches and honor and of punishing with corporal punishment or fines or public disgrace every subject. Why? Because according to the law the sovereign has already made, or if no relevant law has been made, according to the sovereign's judgment about what will encourage men to serve the Commonwealth or to deter them from doing this service to it. Who gets to decide that? The sovereign does. And since you authorized the sovereign, you really decided that. The other thing, the last thing, part 12, to assign the titles of honor. The sovereign has the right to assign honors or assign titles, to appoint what order, place, and dignity each man should hold, what signs of respect they shall give to one another in public or private meetings. The one who fulfills these roles is the one who has the sovereign power. Okay, so let's talk about this for just a bit, shall we? So the sovereign that we're going to have is going to be one person. According to Hobbes, we need one person to have it. And why? Well, let's think of the 3 different types of governments that we can have. 3 different types. We can have the rule of all people. That would be called a democracy. We can have the rule of a small group of elite of people. That would be called an aristocracy. Or we could have the rule of one person. That is called a monarchy. Now, all 3 of those would be the sovereign, right? The sovereign in a democracy would be the demos, or the people. The sovereign in an aristocracy would be the aristocrats, and the sovereign in a monarchy would be the monarch, right? Which one of these should we choose? Well, let's say if we had a democracy, and that everybody is the sovereign. Aren't we really just in a state of war? If everybody is out for themselves and everybody's, is one man against other men, we're just still in a state of war. And that's not really going to get us out of the state of war. So democracy, he thinks, isn't going to work. Now, if we were to move to an aristocracy, then while the subjects would be controlled by the aristocracy, the aristocrats themselves are going to be within a state of war. Why? Because they all have the sovereign power. So what we really need to do is to get out of the state of war, is have one person have all sovereign power, right, to control everything. That is the only way, according to Hobbes, that we can get out of the state of war, right? Now, some of you would say, wait a second here. We don't want this type of society. Let's break society up. Let's say, you know what, we're going to have different branches of government here, all right? We're going to say there's going to be an executive power, there'll be a legislative power, there'll be a judicial power, and then they'll all keep some sort of balance on each other, right? But this is a problem for Hobbes. He says these powers cannot really be shared or separated from one another. He says, for example, if you transfer control of the military, then who's going to be the judge of enforcing the laws? Right? If he gives away control of the military, then there's no way to enforce laws. Right? So there would be no sovereign. If you give away control of doctrines, then men may be frightened into rebellion by the fear of these invisible spirits that people believe in. And if he gives away power of raising money, then he says the military is useless. And so Hobbes states, if we consider any one of the rights I have discussed, we shall immediately see that it is necessary, because the holding of all the others without the one will have no effect on the conservation of peace and justice. Now look, some people are going to complain that they are at the mercy of the lusts and other irregular passions of him who has the unlimited power. The subjects will say they're in a miserable situation because of the whims of the sovereign. If it is a monarchy, they'll call him a tyrant, and that's the fault of the monarchy. If it's an aristocracy or a democracy, they'll fault those who are in charge. So they'll always fault somebody else. And you know what? That's going to happen no matter what type of government it is. So Hobbes really answers this in the following way. He says, first, the human condition can never be without some inconvenience. That is, right? That's just part of what it is to be human. You're not going to get everything your way. There's going to be little inconveniences amongst your life. Two, the greatest trouble is nothing compared to the miseries of civil war and the condition of ungoverned men. No matter how horrible it is to live under a sovereign, it's worse to live in the state of nature, which is a state of war. Remember, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. The other is the sovereign does not want to damage or weaken the subjects, because remember, the sovereign is interested in their own glory. The sovereign is interested in their own strength, and the stronger and more glorious the subjects are, the stronger and more glorious the sovereign is. All right, so they're not going to have that. Next, the stubbornness and from the subjects who don't want to contribute to their own defense and well-being, so the sovereign must force them by paying taxes in peacetime. So, for Hobbes, he says, for all men are provided by nature with notable microscopes, that is, their passions and self-love, through which every little payment appears as a great grievance, but don't have the telescopes, namely moral and political science, that would enable them to see far-off miseries that hang over them, which can be avoided without such payments. So once again, what's worse, living under a sovereign or living in the state of nature? Right? Remember, the state of nature is this horrible place. It is a state of war. You're constantly looking over your shoulder. There's always people trying to kill you. They're always trying to take your stuff. That is what we want to get out of. And no matter how bad it was under the sovereign, they're really minor inconveniences, and it's always better than the state of war. All right? So, all right. So this is what we find in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. He understands human beings, the human body, to be like a machine. He says that we're always trying to get what we want, that is our felicity, that is we're trying to be happy, which is just the attainment of getting the goods that we want. Because of that, we end up clashing with other human beings, and we go man against man, right? Because if I want something and you want something and only one of us can have it, what's going to happen? We're going to go into a state of war. And this is what the state of nature is. If we had no governments, this is what the state of nature would be. It would be a state of war. And so in order to get out of this, we need to seek peace and follow it, right? So we need ultimately to have what we're going to call a social contract with each other. We all agree to lay down certain rights, and I will lay down whatever rights you lay down. And when we all agree to this, and then we're going to give over to an independent power, the sovereign, the ability to decide between disputes and who gets what property. Why? Because this gets us out of the state of war. This is a much better way of living. So even though, yes, there's going to be some problems on what you might consider an injustice under the sovereign, but remember, what is justice? Whatever following the covenants, right? And following whatever the laws happen to be. What is injustice? Breaking your covenant or breaking the laws of what the sovereign says. So, don't break your covenants. Follow the sovereign. And I'll see you next time. All right, everybody. So that's Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. I will talk to you next time. Bye.